We're going to talk about the assassination of Robert Kennedy today. Think about this, this is going to be the third political assassination in a 5-year period of time of major characters in American history. It was a very violent time in American history, and we're even going to have a lecture later when we get back after DC on the colorful and colorless 1960s. It talks about this type of violence. But anyway, what is Robert Kennedy serving as right now, Taylor? He's a senator from New York. And he announced that he was going to try to earn the Democratic nomination for president in 1968. And because of his entrance and the previous entrance of Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, the incumbent President Johnson announces to the nation on March 31st, 1968 that he will not seek re-election. So the Democratic race is wide open now in this election. There were two things that Senator Kennedy ran his campaign on. So everybody has things they're going to talk about. And what's the obvious one? The debate over what? Vietnam. So he's going to run his campaign on the debate over Vietnam. He was an advocate for withdrawing from Vietnam. He saw no sign of military victory. He thought it was a waste of American life to be there. And so one of the things he campaigned on in 1968 during the primaries was the debate over Vietnam. Again, he was an advocate for withdrawing from Vietnam. He saw no sign of military victory, stalemate at best, and thought we ought to get our soldiers out of there because it was an unwinnable war. So he did campaign on that. The second thing he campaigned on was he wanted to reach out to minority groups and poor people all across the country. It didn't necessarily mean that the minority groups are always the poor. There were white people that were poor as well. So he made efforts and wanted the American government to reach out to minority groups and reach out to poor people. So he continued his crusade for people that were less fortunate. Now, in the early summer of 1968, Senator Kennedy was campaigning in two primary elections. One was in South Dakota, and the other one was in California. And that's kind of what they're doing now, right? They're going to different states campaigning in primary elections. We're kind of seeing that now with the upcoming election. Same type of timing. So Kennedy was in both South Dakota and California in the early summer of 1968 campaigning to try to win the primaries in both of those states. And by June 4th of 1968, he had won both primaries. He had won the South Dakota Democratic primary election, and he had won the California Democratic primary election. And that was on June 4th, 1968. He secured both of those victories in the primaries. One in South Dakota and one in California. And they both occurred on June 4th, 1968. Now, the win in California really boosted his chances to be nominated during the 1968 Democratic Convention. That was a big win for him in California. South Dakota, so-so. It was a state that he won, but the California primary was big. And he was very, very pleased with his victory in California on June 4th, 1968. And he was actually in California when the news came out that he won that primary. So he had traveled to California, Los Angeles in particular. So Kennedy is very thrilled with his victory in the California primary. He's in Los Angeles during the victory. And he's going to give a victory speech at the Ambassador Hotel Ballroom early in the morning on June 5th. Okay, so he wins the primary June 4th. He's in Los Angeles. He's staying at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and he's planning on giving a victory speech early in the morning on June 5th. So what do you think the time's going to be when I say early in the morning, June 5th, if he just won the 4th? So it's just going to be a little after what? No, earlier than that. A little after what? Right after what makes you the next day? Okay, so he wins on a little after midnight. So at 12:15 a.m., just 15 minutes into the day of June 5th, 1968, Kennedy is going to deliver a victory speech in the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel. And he does so. Well, immediately after he finishes his speech, he and his entourage, and he exits the hotel through the kitchen area. It was the easiest way, faster way to exit the hotel. He wanted to avoid the media that he knew was going to follow. He kind of just wanted to get out of there. So immediately after he gave his final remarks, and he said it's on, he thanked everybody, and he says, it's on to Chicago and let's win there, and he gave the victory sign. Then he stepped off the podium and headed through the hotel kitchen because it was a faster way to exit the hotel, and he wanted to avoid the media. He didn't really want to spend a bunch of time visiting with the media. It was, 12:15 in the morning. So that was kind of his plan. Well, as he's going through the kitchen, he stops and shakes hands with several well-wishers and the hotel staff throughout the kitchen area. What type of people were working in the kitchen area of the Ambassador Hotel? Yeah, but what kind of people? What's that? Maybe poor people, not people real well off. So he spent time, just kind of shaking hands with some well-wishers through the kitchen, and he made sure he went and shook hands with the workers, because that's kind of that was his thing. So he goes through the kitchen, he stops and shakes hands with several well-wishers and some hotel staff throughout the kitchen area, and as he begins to exit the kitchen, a young man steps in front of him and says, "Kennedy, you son of a bitch." Okay, so as he began to exit the kitchen area, a young man stepped in front of Senator Kennedy and yelled, "Kennedy, you son of a bitch." Shortly after making that comment to Senator Kennedy, he pulled out a .22 caliber revolver and fired 8 times towards Kennedy and his entourage. It was an 8-cylinder .22. So as soon as he yelled, "Kennedy, you son of a bitch," he fired an 8-shot .22 caliber revolver many, many times towards Kennedy and the people around him, his entourage. .22 caliber pistol is not something generally you would use to kill somebody. It's a small caliber pistol, okay? You could be hit with it and survive easily depending on where it hits you, I guess. Well, this assailant was immediately detained. In other words, they're going to catch this assassin right on the spot. And he was detained by 3 people. So after he fired the shots from the 8-shot .22 revolver at Senator Kennedy and the entourage around him, he was quickly subdued or detained by 3 people that were part of Kennedy's support staff. One was a journalist by the name of George Plimpton. George Plimpton. I'll tell you a little bit about each one of these guys because it's kind of interesting. These are all supporters of Kennedy, okay? Journalist George Plimpton. Another man that helped detain the assassin was an Olympic gold medalist in the decathlon, Rayford Johnson. Rayford Johnson helped detain and capture the assailant. And he was a gold medal winner, Olympic gold medal winner in the decathlon, Rayford Johnson. And the third person that even took a more active role in this was a professional football player that played for the Los Angeles Rams by the name of Rosie Greer. So the assailant, after firing the 8-round .22 pistol at Senator Kennedy and his entourage, was detained and captured, so to speak, by journalist George Plimpton, Olympic gold medalist decathlete Rayford Johnson, and professional football player Rosie Greer. Now, you remember what happened during the Oswald assassination when M.N. McDonald grabbed at Oswald and just happened to get his thumb in the hammer so it didn't fire and shoot him? That's actually what Greer did. Rosie Greer jammed his thumb between the trigger of the revolver. Okay, he didn't do it with the hammer, he did it behind the trigger of the revolver to prevent further shots from being fired. So he did not get all 8 shots fired out of that .22, but he shot several. Now, what might you think that would be different than the other 2 assassinations? What's more prevalent at this time? What's that?
Who did it?
Well, how though? When he was making these, what was, without giving it away, what was more prevalent and more public during these campaigns that would have been in '63? Television was there. So you would think there would have been some television footage of this. Well, actually there was not, because they went through that kitchen area and tried to avoid the media. However, there was a reporter by the name of Andrew West who had an audio tape recording of this. So there wasn't any TV cameras following Kennedy through the kitchen and out, because that was the purpose of why they went that route. They wanted to avoid the media. But there was a reporter there by the name of Andrew West who had a little pocket tape player and got an audio recording of the incident, of the scuffle. And how he got that is after he heard shouts that Kennedy had been shot, he then followed the Kennedy party into the kitchen area and then turned on his recorder. So he didn't get an audio recording of the assassination, he got an audio recording of what? The scuffle that ensued with Greer, Plimpton, and Johnson. So nobody really has any video or audio of the assassination. Now, as far as the results of these shots, unfortunately Senator Kennedy was shot twice in his back, which probably he could have survived, but once right behind his right ear, which turned out to be at very close range. So he was shot twice in the back, which he certainly could have survived, but the shot that's going to be the problem is the one that hit him right behind his right ear. A fourth shot hit his clothing and missed. So 4 shots were in the vicinity of Robert Kennedy. 2 hit him in the back, 1 hits him right behind the right ear, and the other one grazes his clothing and misses. And this is, I'm not making this up, as he lay on the floor bleeding, the first thing he said is, "Anyone else hurt?" That was his first comments. Is anyone else hurt? Were there other people hurt, you think? 5 others were wounded. 5 others were wounded during this shooting of Robert Kennedy. I'll tell you who they are and what they were doing. They're all on your ID sheet. So 5 other people were wounded in the shooting. First was Paul Schrade. Paul Schrade. There's a picture of Paul Schrade right up there, laying a picture of Robert Kennedy and a signature of Paul Schrade up there. He was 43 years old, and he was a member of the United Auto Workers Union who was there simply supporting Senator Kennedy. Paul Schrade, 43 years old, member of the United Auto Workers Union, and was simply there in Los Angeles to support Senator Kennedy. Second person that was wounded in the shooting was Elizabeth Evans. Elizabeth Evans. She also was 43 years old, and she was a Democratic Party activist, obviously a supporter of Senator Kennedy. Elizabeth Evans, age 43, a Democratic Party activist. The third person wounded in the shooting was Ira Goldstein. He was just 19, and he was a local radio reporter there to cover Kennedy's speech. Ira Goldstein, just 19 years old, a local radio reporter. The youngest victim wounded in the shooting was Erwin Stroll, just 17, and a Kennedy campaign volunteer. Erwin Stroll, just 17 years old, a Kennedy campaign volunteer. And the final person wounded in the shooting of Robert Kennedy was William Wessel. His picture is up here also. And it's kind of an interesting picture there if you look at it. He was 30 years old, and he was a reporter for ABC News, and he gave a news report back to ABC News in New York as he was lying wounded, if you can imagine that. So William Wessel was 30. He was a reporter for ABC News, and he actually gave a live news report back to New York City as he lay wounded. All those people survived. Senator Kennedy then was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles and immediately underwent emergency surgery. So Senator Kennedy was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital in Los Angeles and was immediately taken into emergency surgery. So what time in the morning are we talking about here? Before 1 a.m., right? Okay, he's taken to the hospital before 1 a.m. and goes into surgery. Well, at 5 o'clock p.m., the same day, although it was many, many hours later, right, because we started so early on the 5th, at 5 p.m. on June 5th, Robert Kennedy's press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, spoke about the senator's condition. At 5 p.m., the evening of June 5th, Robert Kennedy's press secretary, Frank Mankiewicz, spoke publicly to the media about the senator's condition. This is 5 o'clock at night after undergoing major surgeries. And here's how Frank Mankiewicz described the senator's condition. He said, quote, his condition was, quote, extremely critical as to life. Extremely critical as to life. When you're described as extremely critical as to life, are you concerned about survival or recovery at that point? What?
Survival.
Okay, survival, that's correct. Recovery, you're not even worried about. So at that point at 5 o'clock, doctors were much more concerned about his survival than his full recovery. They continued to work on Robert Kennedy, and by 11 o'clock that night, it became very clear that he was dying and would not survive. So by 11 o'clock that evening, it was clear that the senator was dying, would not survive. Finally, at 1:59 a.m., early in the morning on June 6th, Press Secretary Mankiewicz made his second announcement to the media. Finally, at 1:59 a.m. on June 6th, Robert Kennedy's Press Secretary Frank Mankiewicz made his second public announcement to the media. This is what he said. Quote, Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6th, 1968. With Senator Kennedy at the time of his death were his wife Ethel, his sisters Mrs. Stephen Smith and Patricia Lawford, brother-in-law Stephen Smith, and Mrs. John F. Kennedy. He was 42 years old. That's the statement. I'll read it again, write down what you think is important. Mankiewicz says, quote, Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968. With Senator Kennedy at the time of his death were his wife Ethel, his sisters Mrs. Stephen Smith and Patricia Lawford, brother-in-law Stephen Smith, and Mrs. John F. Kennedy. He was 42 years old. Just so you know, Mrs. Stephen Smith, it's a quote, I'll tell you, that was Jean Ann Kennedy, the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, or sister, Robert Kennedy's sister. So Mrs. Stephen Smith was Jean Ann, and obviously Mrs. John F. Kennedy was Jackie. Mankiewicz later was just apologetic because also there, when the senator died, was Senator Edward Kennedy, and Mankiewicz omitted him. He felt terrible about it, so he later apologized to the media for omitting Senator Edward Kennedy from the list of those with Bobby when he died, because Senator Edward Kennedy was there also. But that was the quote that he gave at the time, omitting Ted Kennedy. Well, after his death, Senator Kennedy's body was taken for an autopsy. Where do you think that was done? By the way, just ironically. There in it wasn't the same situation as present. They did the autopsy in Los Angeles. Then they loaded his body on an airplane that was provided by the White House, and at 1:20 p.m. on June 6, 1968, his body was flown back to New York City. So after his death, Senator Kennedy's body was taken for an autopsy. They then loaded his body on an airplane that was provided by the White House, President Johnson. And at 1:20 p.m. on June 6, 1968, his body was flown back to New York City. 1:20 p.m. Flown back. After the arrangements were made, the body was secured and everything was ready for funeral, they took it to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City for the funeral mass. So Senator Kennedy's body was taken to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City for the funeral mass. And it was on June 8th of 1968, that Senator Kennedy's funeral mass was conducted at St. Patrick's Cathedral, June 8th, 1968. Who do you think they chose to give the eulogy? No, that's a good guess, but no, or family.
Jack.
No. Ted. That poor guy's given so many eulogies in his life since then. John Kennedy Jr. I mean, he's just given a lot. I want to read the end of his eulogy. I think you'll enjoy it. Kennedys don't cry is a creed. Ted Kennedy had quite a time getting through this, and you'll see it on video where he had a hard time. But this is what he said. My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death what he was in life. He should be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it. Those of us who loved him and who take him to his rest today pray what he was to us and what he wished for others will someday come to pass for all the world. As he said many times in many parts of this nation to those he touched and who sought to touch him, quote,